So, welcome everyone. This is the very first MRCA training. Since the MRCA rules were adopted in 2017, the 25 MRCA communities with zoning authority have adopted MRCA plans. And to date, 20 of the 25 communities have adopted an ordinance, and of the 5 who have not, it looks like 4 are on track to do so by next month. So this training is hopefully timely and is for all those communities who have adopted a zoning ordinance or will be doing so shortly. I think there might be a few people attending today not representing these cities and townships, which is great. However, today's is a technical training specifically related to zoning ordinance administration. I want to make sure we have time for the communities who have MRCA ordinances to ask questions. Also, some of you have ordinances that exceed the MRCA standards, which is wonderful, and we support that. But so this training is practical and useful for everyone. The training will just focus on the minimum standards. So with that, before starting, I'd like also to introduce our 3 metro area hydrologists who are your first point of contact if you have questions about your MRCA ordinance. These are also the same people that you should be sending notices to for public hearings for issues related to the MRCA. So I am just going to turn my camera off and let Taylor, Wes, and Dan introduce themselves.
All right, I'm Taylor Hinker. I'm the South Metro area hydrologist, so I cover Dakota, Scott, and Carver counties.
Thanks, Taylor. I'm Wes Saunders Pierce. I'm the DNR area hydrologist for the North Metro, which includes Hennepin and Anoka counties. And before I came over to the DNR, I spent 10 years in local government at the city of St. Paul. So always good to work with LGU partners. Dan?
Thanks, Wes and Taylor. This is Dan Scollin. I'm the East Metro area hydrologist, so that includes Ramsey and Washington counties. And glad to be here and glad to work with you all.
Great, thank you very much. All right, well, let's move on. Today we are going to do an overview of the MRCA and talk about some of the fundamental concepts in the MRCA. We're going to go through the dimensional standards and then spend most of our time going through the key provisions with a focus on common residential development issues. And then we'll talk a little bit about some administrative stuff at the end. So in order to make this as interesting and as practical as possible for you, we're including some quizzes, polling, if you will, and a few example problems. I'm hoping that you'll participate and make this interesting for all of us. And just so we can get going with that, I also want to mention we'll try to take a break at the halfway point because this is a 2-hour training, and I'm sure you'll need a break by then. But we will be using the Slido platform for some of our quizzes. And so there's a link to Slido in the chat box. And so if you would all go to the chat box now and open the very first link. I put in a number of links already, but the Slido link is the very first one. And it's faster than if you try to get to Slido using the code on the screen. So please go there and open it. When your Slido browser page opens, it'll probably open to a tab called Q&A. We're not going to use that tab. We're going to use the tab that says polls. So if you would just click on that tab, you'll be set. When you open it, it's going to be blank. It won't be populated until we get to the very first quiz, if you will. So also, if some of you would like to use Slido on your mobile device, you can scan the QR code on the screen. All right, well, moving right along. So to start us off, let's quickly go through some of the MRCA concepts and why we have the MRCA today. As you know, MRCA is a land corridor along the Mississippi River, only in the 7-county metro area. This is an area where there are special land use regulations that guide development activity. The MRCCA is not new. It was actually established in the 1970s by a governor's executive order. It also shares the same boundary with the Mississippi National River Recreation Area. And that was established in 1988. The old governor's executive order was finally replaced with the 2017 state regulations, which are now the basis for all local ordinances. While there are multiple purposes for the MRCCA rules, I would say preserving scenic character and natural resources are the primary purposes. The MRCCA does speak to recreational goals and transportation goals, but just by looking at the enabling statute and the rules, most of them are focused around scenic and natural resources. So one of the most interesting things about the MRCCA program that's different from any other DNR land use program is that there is both a MRCCA plan and a MRCCA ordinance. All of you have now adopted a MRCCA plan. It was part of your 2040 comprehensive plan, and that provides the policy backdrop for your MRCCA ordinance. Administration of the ordinance relies heavily at times on the maps and descriptions of primary conservation areas, public river corridor views, and vegetation restoration areas that are identified, described, and mapped in your MRCCA plan. So these resources are referenced in your ordinance, and you need to be aware that when you come across those references, you need to turn to your MRCCA plan to understand what they are. Most of the primary conservation areas are also shown on the DNR's online mapping application, which Matt is now putting a link in the chat box for that. And the vegetation restoration priorities and PCAs are also GIS files that you can download either from the Minnesota Geospatial Commons, or you can find links to these on the DNR webpage. And these again are links in the chat box. The only place that you're going to find public river corridor views is in your MRCCA plan. So just keep in mind that that's where you need to look for these things. On the screen right now, I'm just showing that we have a lot of tools. And again, these are all links in the chat box, but these are things that are also available for your residents so that they can look up these things as well. So don't forget to explore those when you have a chance. So let's talk briefly about primary conservation areas. This is the complete list. But frankly, most of you are probably going to be dealing primarily with the bluff impact zone, shore impact zone, and significant existing vegetative stands. The regulations address these more commonly than almost all the others combined. So make sure you know where these are in your communities and have access to the maps, and you'll be in good shape. I just want to touch on the concept of a bluff impact zone right off the bat. It's not intuitive, but the bluff impact zone is just simply the bluff and then 20 feet within the bluff, around the bluff. So in this profile, you're seeing the 20 feet extend beyond the actual bluff itself, both bottom and top, but it's really 20 feet around the entire bluff. So it's not just the top and the bottom. But this is what we mean when we talk about the bluff impact zone. We'll look at the bluff definition later on today. All right, so one of the more complex part of the MRCCA ordinance is the idea of a public river corridor view. All communities were required to map and describe at least one of these in their plan. So when your ordinance refers to a public river corridor view, it is really only referring to the view or views documented in your plan. So it's not just any view that happens to be scenic, it's just the ones you've identified in your plan. And going back to your plan, there are two types of public river corridor views you could have documented. One is a view towards the river from a public park, and one is a view towards a bluff, which we're showing in the screen here. from the ordinary high of the opposite shore. So also, I just want to mention, if you have any questions along the way, please put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll try to address them for everybody. All right, here is an example from Mendota Heights. Mendota Heights mapped 4 public river corridor views. You can see they have a map showing numbers, and those numbers correspond to the images on the right side of the screen. So hopefully everybody has a well-documented set of public river corridor views in their plan for use in administering their ordinance. And then lastly, your MRCA plan also maps and describes vegetation restoration priorities. And here's simply an example from Newport. It's in the goldenrod color. And for those of you who maybe don't know what this means, restoration priorities are any primary conservation area that doesn't have any natural vegetation. So for example, it could be a bluff impact zone or a shore impact zone that doesn't have any natural vegetation. These are important resource areas that could be at heightened risk to erosion if there isn't any vegetation to stabilize soils. Hence, they're identified as a priority area for restoration during a subdivision process or any project requiring a vegetation or land alteration permit. And when we get to those topics, we'll come back to this idea here. All right, so hopefully you are all logged into Slido. This is our first quiz today. And the question is, where can you find information on all 3 primary conservation areas, public river corridor views, and vegetation restoration areas? You can select more than one. Recreation is one of the purposes, but it's not the key or main purpose that is recognized by all the provisions that address natural and scenic protections. So thank you for that. Let's look at the next question here. This is the question now. Where can you find primary conservation areas, public river corridor views, and vegetation restoration areas? More than one may be selected here as well. All right, looks like most people have settled on a question or an answer here. The correct answer is your MRCA plan. This is the only place you can find all 3 of these resource descriptions. You can find public river corridor views only in your MRCA plan, whereas you can find PCAs and vegetation restoration areas on the DNR mapping application and or the Minnesota Geospatial Commons. So your MRCA plan is really always the first place to go, but if you'd like to map these things, you've got some other options as well. So, all right, moving on to dimensional standards. So there are 3 dimensional standards in the critical area ordinance, and they all vary by district, as you can see in this table. Requirements for ordinary high water level and bluff structure setbacks, as well as structure height, vary by district. Unlike the shoreland ordinance that some of you may be familiar with, there is no impervious surface standard, and there is also no minimum lot size standards, with one exception. New riparian lots in the ROS district must be at least 200 feet wide, but there's no minimum lot area. Every other MRCA standard that we'll be talking about today applies universally throughout all districts. In 2 districts, the river towns and crossings and the urban mixed districts, structures are allowed to exceed the maximum height through a conditional use permit, and we'll cover that more in a moment. Also of note is that building height standards in the RTC, urban mixed, and urban core districts include 2 subjective standards. RTC and districts allow heights up to 48 and 65 feet respectively, and there's no height limit in the UC district. Due to the relaxed height standards in these areas compared to the very restrictive standards in the old executive order regulations, these 2 subjective provisions help to minimize visual impacts. The idea of the tiering concept is to step back the upper floors of a building to minimize impacts of views to and from the rivers and bluffs, and to require that structures be designed to minimize impacts to public river corridor views. We acknowledge that the challenge of the tiering standard and that it only makes practical sense in a few areas where buildings would be built close to the river or bluff and where the lot area and building footprints are large enough to construct buildings where step backs would still allow for usable floor area. So we know that this is somewhat of a problematic provision, and we acknowledge it's vague and it's practical probably only in a few situations. The second item on the screen here states that structures should be designed in place to minimize interference with views. While this is also relatively vague, it does provide communities with some leverage to improve structure design through the development process. This slide lays out how the setback or placement standards are written. All structures, impervious surfaces, and facilities must meet ordinary high and bluff setbacks. We recognize these are restrictive standards. However, there are a wide variety of exceptions to these standards in the exceptions table in your ordinance. In this slide here, we're laying out what some of the exceptions are for a residential application. And you can see here that the yellow highlighting indicates facilities that are exempt from the ordinary high and bluff setbacks. You'll need to read the notes in the exceptions table that refer to specific standards that apply in these situations, but residential properties have some flexibility with some of these structures and facilities. An especially challenging topic are swimming pools. Swimming pools are not specifically addressed in the rules, either as a facility or as an example of impervious surface. Under most common interpretations, pools would be considered impervious surface subject to the structure setback requirements. All right, we have another quiz for you, and that is, what is the purpose of regulating building height with a conditional use permit? In this case, there is just one answer. All right, it looks like everybody is pretty close to being done, and that is the correct answer. The main purpose of regulating building height with a CUP is to minimize impacts to PRCVs. All the other options here are methods for doing that, but the purpose of all these things is to minimize visual impacts to PRCVs. All right, moving on to key provisions with a focus on residential development. The first item we want to take a look at here is the patio and deck encroachment provision. The ordinances do allow encroachment for patios and decks into an ordinary high water setback without a variance based on a formula, as long as it's not in the bluff impact zone. This provision also requires compliance with the vegetation management and land alteration standards, and we'll get to that too, but just know that there are some caveats to this encroachment. So what I'd like to do now is, and by the way, this graphic that's on the screen is also in your ordinance, but I'd like to look at an example here, and this example was provided by Lexi, I think planner with the City of Champlin. And what we have here is a deck and patio example from the residential neighborhood district. I'm hoping that you will chime in with your questions or comments about this problem. You don't need to raise your hand here. We just want to encourage some discussion. So this is an opportunity to get out of your box. So we have here an example, a lot that has a 100-foot setback requirement. In this case, the lot is 100 feet wide. And in the blue box here, we have an existing 500 square foot deck. And shown in green is a proposal to add a 200 square foot deck. And so we're wanting to know, is this possible? So to answer this question, of course, we need to apply this formula. And so if you would take a moment just to think about how you might answer the question here, can this proposed patio be allowed? If so, why or why not? And how do you determine that?
There are a few comments. It is not allowed. I think it would be allowed. Max total allowance is 375 square feet. Existing is 500 square feet. They can't have more. they could encroach 375 square feet, so 200 would be fine. That's what we've got in the chat box.
Okay, so yes, I heard some good comments in there. So you just need to apply the formula. In this case here, we have a 100-foot setback, and you multiply that times 0.15 times the lot width of 100 feet times 0.25 to get the maximum total area, which is 375 feet for a deck or patio to encroach into the setback. We already have a deck of 500 square feet, so that's already exceeding the limit, so the patio could not be allowed. So, great. Thank you. Moving on, we have a little discussion here on water-oriented accessory structures. Your ordinance allows one water-oriented accessory structure on each lot, or one per 300 feet of shoreline. The definition for a water-oriented accessory structure is on the screen. These are basically small structures for use in storing equipment that you might need for using the river. There are a lot of things that can be considered a water-oriented accessory structure. And there's some examples here, including gazebos, greenhouses, fish houses, pump houses, decks, and patios. And so, you have an option to use a lot of have many different facilities as long as in total they don't exceed the 120 square foot limit for the water-oriented accessory structure. So we have another example here. Again, compliments of Lexi and Champlin. So we have an existing fish house that's 25 feet from the river, already at 120 square feet. And this property owner wants to add a 60 square foot patio next to the fish house. And the question here is, can they add this new patio next to the fish house? And again, either answer in the chat or feel free to speak up. Just take your microphone off mute and just let us know. Gary, do you mind just if there's any comments in the chat, letting us know?
Yeah, we've got one response saying it is not allowed. You get one accessory structure, not two. And if combined, it exceeds 120 square feet.
That's generally right. However, you can have more than one facility or structure as long as the total square footage of the multiple facilities or structures is no more than 120 square feet. So that the point of this is to provide some flexibility for people to have, a variety of things to suit their particular needs. So the key thing here is the limit.
Dan, because I thought it did say just one in the provisions.
It says one water-oriented accessory structure, but you can have a variety of facilities that don't exceed 120 square feet. So I guess what we're saying is that you can do that this is fine with us. Our concern is with impervious surface close to the water.
Okay.
And so if people want to have a few different things that don't add up to more than 120 square feet, that helps people address their needs, but still protects or limits the impervious surface near the water.
Dan, we've got a question in the chat that says, do they have to abut?
Abut. Oh, you mean like in this case here, this person wanted to put their patio next to the fish house? No, they don't have to. The key thing here is we're just trying to make sure there's a upward cap on the amount of square footage of impervious surface next to the water. So
is that something that makes sense to amend in the code then? I mean, in terms of interpreting.
If you wanted to do that, yes, you certainly could. The intention was to provide flexibility, and that's why we wrote the definition the way we did. But yeah, if the way it's written seems to prohibit that, then that would be something that you could do, and that would be fine. We would be supportive of that. And as if you're thinking about some amendments, we can talk about that later on. We've certainly made some changes to our model ordinance on some bluff definitions that we'll get to at the end of this, where you might want to amend your ordinance as well. So it might behoove you to maybe think about a few things that after you've been working with it for a while, discover that, we'd like to clarify a few things, and we're certainly happy to work with you to do that.
Dan, we've been challenged a few times of landscapers or homeowners asking if they can put in a larger patio by the river if they use pervious pavers. What are your thoughts on that?
We really want to limit hard surface next to the river. I know it says impervious. That is, I guess you could say that could be a loophole in the rules. But the point is to allow for vegetation next to the river with a few carve outs for impervious surface or hard surface. And that, this is one of them with the water oriented accessory structure here. That is something that would probably meet your ordinance, but it is not intended to allow that because there's probably no end then if people say it's not impervious.
Yeah, and would still be considered a structure, right, Dan? Even if it was permeable?
Yeah, it's certainly if it was a patio, we talk about patios. And a patio could be, I suppose, of a variety of different materials, but it could be a hard surface of any material. So this is an issue in the shoreline program too, where some local governments have looked at permeable pavement as not being impervious. But yeah, I think the purpose is to limit the removal of vegetation in the near shore area, and it doesn't really matter whether that's impervious or pervious. It's still a hard surface that doesn't allow vegetation to be there. So there is some vagueness in those areas, but I think you certainly could say it's a patio is a patio regardless of what it's made with. Good questions.
I guess, and I don't want to belabor that point, but could you see a scenario where DNR would support a definition to exclude certain things that are more pervious, or is it? Because this one I think is a pretty common one in our community, where with the square footage limits, it's relatively small, I guess, depending upon how big the property is to do. If it's 120 square feet of patio and it's a humongous lot, sometimes the two don't connect very well.
Right. Yeah. So yes, the answer is we'd be happy to talk to you about something that makes some sense. If there are certain situations that you think where there could be some loopholes and some other areas where you think that some flexibility is needed, the MRCCA rules do provide options for some flexibility in deviating from the standards in the rules. We should take that up later. Yeah. All right, let's move on. So the next series of provisions we're going to talk about deal with conformities and nonconformities. The ordinance specifically identifies things as conformities. This may be odd to you, but it was an important issue to many different interests during the rulemaking process. So we have a few provisions that may come into play for you. First, the idea here that new structures that are sited or placed in conformance with the setback averaging provisions are specifically identified as conforming. And that may be important for many property owners. In the North Metro area, we remember during the rulemaking that was an especially important concept for them. So always good to remind them that structures cited in that way are conforming. And then secondly, there are a variety of things that are defined as legal site alterations. And these things could be, vegetation that's already been intensively cleared, erosion control structures, stormwater devices, or other non-structural things. We don't really like this part, but this is what came out of the rulemaking in order to get a package completed. And so, here's an example of things that would fall as an identified conformity. You couldn't do this now, but this is considered a conformity under the rules. This is just an example of conformities that are identified. On the other end of the spectrum, some nonconformities that are addressed. The ordinance does allow non-conforming structures to expand laterally, as long as they don't encroach further into the setback or not in the shore impact zone or bluff impact zone. So we have a graphic that comes from the model ordinance that shows how expansions can be allowed laterally, but not if they're moving closer to the setback or go beyond the setback. So another part of this provision is that these lateral expansions are allowed as long as the scale is consistent with the existing structure and surrounding structures. The idea here is not to allow somebody to sort of turn a smaller structure into a McMansion or something that's completely out of scale with the neighborhood. But again, that's a subjective issue that is kind of locally determined. Okay, moving on to vegetation. These standards are probably one of the biggest changes in the MRCA regulations in these 2017 rules. The most important thing to know is that a permit is required to manage how intensive vegetation clearing is handled and how the site is to be restored. First off, the vegetation standards prohibit intensive clearing in these 5 areas, unless you have a permit, which we'll cover in a moment. This graphic shows 4 of the 5 areas where clearing is prohibited. All of these areas, except within 50 feet of a wetland or drainage area, are also primary conservation areas. So in this graphic, intensive clearing in the white zone is allowed without a permit. But if you wanted to do intensive clearing in any of these colored zones, that would require a permit. Also note that intensive clearing is the removal of all or a majority of the trees or shrubs in a contiguous patch, strip, or row or block. And that's the definition at the bottom of the screen from the definition section of the ordinance. It's not all intensive clearing in the MRCA, just if it happens to be in these 5 areas.
Dan, if I can interrupt you, I think you've got a question regarding your previous slide. They ask, I understand the averaging rule only applies to new construction, not an addition to an existing home. Is that true?
Yeah, the averaging applies to new structures. It specifically says new structures. So as you said, a permit is required for intensive clearing in those 5 areas, or it's prohibited, I should say, in those 5 areas, unless it's one of these following activities, and then it has to have a permit to do it. So you may look at some of these and wonder, well, why is a permit needed for this type of clearing? Isn't removing dead, diseased, dying trees and shrubbery a good thing? And yes, it is a good thing. But the reason for the permit is to ensure that the intensive clearing is, in fact, for these reasons, and that the clearing is no more than needed. And then lastly, to make sure that it's done in a way that protects other vegetation and doesn't contribute to erosion. So the permit process is an opportunity for you to work with a property owner to make sure that this sort of intensive clearing activity is done according to the intent and in a way that doesn't contribute to soil erosion into the river. So just want to point out that there are general performance standards that go along with the vegetation permit. They're nothing too exotic, but just sort of best management practices. So we're not going to go through those here today. But I want you to understand the basic concepts. I also want to point out that selective removal, as defined on the bottom of the screen here, is allowed without a permit. And so some of the very same things we just saw, like removing dead, diseased, dying, or hazardous vegetation, is allowed if it's done selectively, which is really just the removal of isolated trees or shrubs. It's not a wholesale removal. So this type of activity is definitely allowed without a permit. And also, maybe it doesn't need to be mentioned, but for some people, the ordinance does specifically say that, lawn and yard maintenance, right-of-way maintenance, and emergency removal of vegetation are all allowed without a permit. So just want to be clear about that.
Dan, you do have a question in the chat. They ask if someone removes trees without a permit, is it solely on the city to enforce this, or does the DNR have authority to enforce it?
No, it's the city's ordinance, and the city has authority to enforce anything in the ordinance. The DNR doesn't have any enforcement authority for local zoning. So, and that's true everywhere in the state, whether it's a shoreland ordinance or a wild and scenic river ordinance or in the Lower St. Croix ordinance. It's always the local government that has the authority to enforce the ordinance. Good question, though. It comes up all the time. So, all right, moving on to the restoration plan. So whenever a vegetation is removed with a permit in those situations, restoration is always required through a restoration plan. Failing to get a permit when one is required also would require then preparation and implementation of a restoration plan. So we're hoping there's some penalty for people who might say, I will just do it and ask for, ask for permission later. It's important that people do the right thing up front. If they don't, they're going to have to restore the vegetation that they removed illegally. So a restoration plan may also be required during the subdivision process if the site being subdivided was identified in your MRCA plan as containing restoration areas. So we'll talk about subdivisions later on too, but your ordinance will guide the location of restoration in priority areas, and those areas could include stabilization of soils, restoration of the shoreland area, restoration of visible bluffs or slopes, or perhaps other places that have been identified in your MRCA plan. So there are more details in the ordinance about how much has to be restored. The minimum standards require that if native plant communities are removed with a permit, then those have to be restored like for like, or the general amount. If it's other types of vegetation, which we call significant existing vegetative stands, that is sort of on a more practicable basis. So it's something that you would have to work out with a property owner on how much of that vegetation to restore. So that's a fairly extensive section in your ordinance, and we're happy to help you interpret it if you need help with that.
Yeah, if proposed improvements or site alterations are out as shown, does a site plan or survey need to show the PCAs?
Under the section of the ordinance that is called submittal requirements, that has a bulletized item that says identify primary conservation areas. So I would think for submittal requirements for some sort of construction work, you would need to show where the PCAs are located on a site. And that includes native plant communities, as well as this other category called significant existing vegetative stands. And the point of that is to try to minimize impacts to those areas and site the project to minimize impacts as much as possible. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a mapping application, and there's a link to that. For each property, they can look and see where these primary conservation areas are located on their property. And there's also GIS files for anybody who works with GIS to be able to show property owners on their parcel where these might be located as well. So we've tried to make this information widely available so people can access it and know what they're working with.
Hey, Dan, if I can ask a question, I posted that question in the chat. Are those submittal requirements specific to the vegetation and land disturbance permit application? Because I guess where I'm getting at with this is, let's say you have a conforming property, they want to put a deck off the back of their house, they're going to apply for a permit, and we're using the web-based application. It's clearly out as shown. Would it be wise to still require a survey showing all those PCAs?
When you say out as shown, can you explain what you mean by that?
Out as shown, based on the web application, you'd use the web application and you'd see that the home is clearly not encumbered by any sort of PCA.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that the home and the proposed deck are not in a piece. There's no PCAs there.
Yeah. Would a copy survey be required in that case?
Oh,
I
no, I
understand.
wouldn't. Yeah, no, I
That's
don't
perfect.
think that would be needed. I mean, we want, and the submittal requirements have a caveat, that say these things should be submitted as directed by staff. So if it's clear just by looking at the mapping application, that there's not a PCA there, I would say you would need to require somebody to do a survey to identify the location of any of these things.
That's clear. Thank you.
Yeah. So we want to make this as easy and practical as possible. Mike, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, quick question. What happens if the property owner states that there is significant existing vegetation stands on site? The map states that, but it looks like the map was completed off of GIS data. I don't think maybe there is field blocks, but how do you address that when they state that, or how should a municipality face that when they say, I don't agree with that?
Well, I think that might be a case where maybe you could ask them to submit some photographs, or
Okay.
if you have time to go look at the site. The GIS mapping is not infallible, and there are situations that significant existing vegetation is mapped, but if you look at it, it's like, no, it's not really, and it doesn't meet the definition of what it is. It's just maybe weeds or undergrowth that is just sort of grown from disturbance, but from aerial photography and some of the GIS work, that wasn't evident. So the idea is to be practical in applying these standards. So I would think a photo submitted or a staff visit would be easy enough to make that determination.
So after that, let's say we do visit the site and it turns out that there's no findings, there's nothing on site. Do we have to work with the DNR to amend that map, or we just kind of let the applicant go?
Just let it go. I mean,
Okay.
this sort of thing is very common. I mean, as
Yeah,
we map the whole corridor, and GIS is not infallible, and so it's intended to be a guide and to make things a little more easily streamlined. But you still need to have field knowledge, come to the table, and make some decisions based on that.
Well, that's great. I appreciate it, Dan. Thank you.
Sure.
Dan, if I may jump in on that, when we created that data set, it was a data set that was created by the National Park Service, and it was fairly detailed, but I think that there's broad recognition that, pretty much throughout the corridor, it's all disturbed. And, I mean, although, the large swaths of vegetation might be, largely buckthorn, that vegetation might not, in and of itself be of, quality and, significant, being a subjective term, but it also, preserves the viewshed of the water, which is one of the, primary goals of the program and the vegetative protection. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Great.
I agree. I think the question I have more or less is the DNR native plant communities. That's the one that I kind of look at, and I kind of go to Dan's point. When you look at the GIS and compare it, it looks like a lot of times, sometimes they pick up parking lots, and there's some other things, not parking lots per se, but they pick up some things that aren't necessarily vegetated areas. And that's where the question comes from, is you look at it, you're like, well, that's, I have a couple of examples in Cottage Grove. I'm looking at a map right now where it says native plant communities, but there's subdivisions there that have been there since the 80s. So that's where the question comes up of how far do you go with the data?
Yep. It's important to look at this and and be practical in what you're seeing. So, but yeah, there are some situations where a field visit might be appropriate to really determine the quality and value of that vegetation, because as Matt said, protection of scenic views is one of the key purposes of this set of regulations. All right, let's move on and come back to this later if people have more questions. So our next question for you is, what things are specifically identified as conformities? Select all that apply.
Is that a typo, Dan? Conformities versus nonconformities?
No, we're looking. The ordinance identifies some things as conformities.
Okay.
Well, it looks like we have quite a few answers here. So the ordinance does identify two things as conformities. The first is legal site alterations existing before ordinance adoption. This was that picture I showed you of all the boulder going up the slope of the riverbank. That was an example of an existing site alteration. Presuming it was done legally, it would be a conformity, identified conformity. And then secondly, any new structure that's placed using the setback averaging provision is also identified as a conforming structure in the ordinance. So those are the two items. So it looks like most everyone got those right. So excellent. And now we have one more question about vegetation. When is a vegetation restoration plan required? And select all that apply. All right, looks like we have most of our answers in. And there are two situations when a vegetation plan is required. One is if you fail to get a required permit. This is sort of the penalty for not getting a permit. You have to do a plan and do the restoration. And then the other situation is for vegetation removed with a permit. And so, as you recall, there are situations where generally you're prohibited from removing vegetation in those 5 areas that were shown on the screen, except for some activities with a permit. So, intensely removing a bunch of diseased vegetation in a bluff impact zone is allowed with a permit. And so anytime you get a vegetation permit, it also comes with a restoration plan requirement. So the third item on the screen here, it says when vegetation is intentionally removed anywhere in the MRCA is not right, because if there is no primary conservation area, or if it's not within 50 feet of a drainage area or something like that, that was the 5th item on that list. If it's not within one of those priority areas, you can certainly intentionally remove vegetation, and there's no standards around that at all. The point is to protect vegetation in those 5 key areas and to prohibit it in most situations, but when it is allowed, it should be done with a permit. So, and of course, selective vegetation removal, that's the one-off, people want to just take out one tree or a shrub or something like that to improve a view. No permit needed for that. So let's see here. Let's look at land alteration here, and then I think we'll take a little break. So there is also a requirement for a land alteration permit in a number of situations, and one of those areas is in the bluff impact zone. In general, land alteration is not allowed in the bluff impact zone except for these 3 things with a permit. So if you want to do an erosion control project, perhaps a situation like we're showing on the screen where you have, obvious problems with a bluff that's falling down. If you need to do some, if it's the minimum needed for exceptions, and in the exceptions always refer to that table at the end of your ordinance. There's a variety of situations identified in that table where you can do land alteration in a bluff with a permit. And then the other key thing is if you've got an existing building or facility of some sort in a bluff that needs to be repaired or maintained, then you can go and do that. But again, you need to do it with a permit, the idea being that we want you, the zoning administrator, to be understanding what they're proposing to do and to make sure that the appropriate best management practices are in place before they start the project. So, and again, the land alteration permit has some BMPs, which I just mentioned, but they also require compliance with the vegetation standards. So if somebody were to do a project in the bluff impact zone that required, intensive vegetation removal, that would probably be allowed, but you would need to do some sort of restoration plan associated with that. And if you recall, there were some priority areas for restoration, and each site is unique, and you would look at that site along with the property owner and figure out, where should the vegetation restoration occur. in a situation like this, it would probably make sense to try to do some restoration on this bluff impact zone after, say, an erosion control project was finished. So that's one situation where you need a land alteration permit. Another one that I want to call to your attention is dealing with riprap walls and erosion control structures. So in the bluff impact zone, or water quality impact zone, which is a new term today at least, and I put that definition at the bottom of the screen here, which is from the definition section of your ordinance. This happens to be land within the shore impact zone or within 50 feet of a public water, wetland, or natural drainage way. So in addition to the river, you may have some wetlands in your community that are within the MRCCA, in which case those are considered a water quality impact zone, and this particular set of provisions would apply. So one of the key points of these set of regulations is, especially along the river, to make sure that if someone is proposing to do a riprap or perhaps even a wall at the ordinary high, that the DNR is involved in the process and provides approval before you, as the local government administrator, would permit the project. So if we want to try to coordinate these permits, it's not uncommon for local governments to permit projects and that include sort of work at or below the water. And people think they have a permit, they can go do the project when in fact they really do need a DNR permit for work in a public water. So this is an attempt to coordinate and sort of sync a DNR approval first before the local government gives its approval. So there's that piece, but I also want to emphasize that this sort of work is really only allowed to correct an erosion problem. It's not allowed just because aesthetically people might want to have a boulder wall. They really have to have an erosion problem that they're trying to solve. So if people do want to put in a riprap or a wall, there are sort of dimensional limits. Walls cannot be any higher than 5 feet high or 10 feet apart, and riprap can't be higher than the regulatory flood protection elevation at 1 foot above the 1% flood. And this schematic that I'm showing here is from the model ordinance. So it gives people a sense of what the standards are in a graphical format. Now, larger walls are allowed, or maybe more riprap than this is allowed, but a registered engineer would need to determine that a larger structure is needed to correct the erosion problem. So that's an important part of the ordinance. And so before we take a break, I just thought, let's do one last exercise on this topic. And this idea, or the problem here, is that this property owner, also in Champlin, wants to replace an existing retaining wall. And this retaining wall location is located in 2 primary conservation areas. It's in a bluff impact zone, which is shown in tan, and it's also mapped as within the significant existing vegetative stands area, which is the green stipple. And so what they want to do is to replace the existing retaining wall with a 4-foot boulder wall that's 2 feet closer to the ordinary high. So the questions for you is this wall allowed? How would you make a decision on whether to allow sort of the replacement of this wall? Is a DNR permit needed? Is a local permit needed? How would you approach this problem? I guess, we're just sort of interested in your thoughts on this. And this is a photo that was submitted by the applicant. I don't know if you can kind of see it. We have a proposed wall that comes out 2 feet from the existing retaining wall. It's a little higher than the existing retaining wall. Gary, are we seeing any comments in the chat box?
No comments in the chat. No, we just have one come in that says local permits needed.
Mhm.
No DNR.
Well, on the DNR question, I think in this situation, maybe not, but you know, it's pretty close to the river. The water level here looks, maybe it's on the low side. That doesn't mean that that's the ordinary high. It might be very valuable to contact the DNR and find out what the ordinary high is at this location, just to make sure that this wall 2 feet out from the existing wall isn't at the ordinary high. So I guess I would certainly encourage you to check that off the list before giving a permit. I would suggest that. I think one of the things here would be to decide whether to replace this wall is there an existing erosion problem? And you know, we can't really tell that from this picture, but you know, if there was, and you know, and we don't define what that is, you know, so a lot of communities sometimes have a very lax interpretation of that, but I'm hoping that, you know, when we think that there's an erosion problem, that, you know, this is a significant problem, that if it's not corrected, you know, there could be major slope failure or erosion into the river. So right now it's hard to tell, but, you know, that would be something you would determine through site inspection. There's also the question here about if you did allow this project, you know, this isn't a mapped area of significant existing vegetation. So, you know, what happens there? Is there intensive removal of this? You might need to have some sort of restoration plan, but you may look at this and go, you know, that doesn't really meet the definition of significant existing vegetative stands. And I didn't put that definition on the screen, but these areas are defined as being natural areas that contain significant remnants of sort of native plant communities. They do have some disturbance in them, but they still retain significant remnants of native plant communities. And so in this case, you know, it looks like there's some ferns and maybe just a lot of volunteers growing in there. It's hard to know from this picture whether that's true or not. So you would want to sort of make some determination on that as well before making a decision. So I'm not giving you a definitive answer here, but there are certainly some considerations that you would want to address before making a decision on whether to allow this sort of replacement, and if so, you know, what are the conditions of that approval.
Dan, and before you move on, there were a couple more responses I just would share with you that are pretty consistent with what you have already talked about, but they say a local permit, but DNR should be notified to see if they have any concerns. Another one says, what is the erosion issue? If not any, then can't be closer in regards to the rock wall or the boulder wall.
Yep.
Just a comment I have as a former area hydrologist, and it has nothing to do with their proposed retaining wall, but the existing riprap, it would be important to determine where that ordinary high water level is, because what I'm seeing with those large boulders, essentially a boulder wall at the lake's edge, you know, if the DNR permit is required, that's typically not what we'd like to see. We certainly would require a permit for that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, I'm not. Are you saying that this is an existing situation here? That would you say that should be addressed during this permit process? It's an existing condition.
Yeah, if DNR staff were on site to survey the ordinary high water level, and we determined that the existing riprap at the lake edge was below the OHW, that would be an enforcement action on DNR because it's a potential violation. But that was something that the DNR area hydrologist would take care of that. Okay.
Just to clarify, this is a river, but it's the same whether it's a river or a lake. Yeah. Okay. All right. Any questions or thoughts from anybody on that? Hello, everybody. I'm back. And what we'd like to do next is move on to some administrative tasks. And the first task I want to cover, I'm hoping you're all back because this is important. I'm going to sort of slow walk this here a bit just to make sure people are sort of getting back. But I want to talk about making a bluff determination. Whether you do this as an administrator or answer questions from surveyors who will be making the determination, it's important to understand these bluff-related definitions. The bluff definitions can be confusing, so we're going to go through the written definitions first, and then we're going to apply them to a visual example. So here on the left is the bluff definition, and on the right are the toe and top of bluff definitions. The first thing I want you to notice is that the toe and top of bluff definitions are part of the bluff definition itself. So you need to apply the toe and top of bluff definitions, or find where the toe and top is, as part of making a bluff determination. Secondly, I want you to notice that the toe and top bluff definitions are structured the same and nearly identical, except for these highlighted words. Please take a moment and just read these definitions to understand how they're structured and how they are slightly different from each other. Hopefully you notice that these are just the inverse of each other and written for, one location that's at the bottom and the other location that's at the top. Also, I want you to notice that the bluff definition contains this parameter that says measured over any horizontal distance of 25 feet. I'm pointing this out in order to say that this phrase of 25 feet is duplicative because it also shows up in both the toe and the top of bluff definitions. And I'm pointing this out because this phrase in the bluff definition has caused some confusion with communities in the past. And, I think it's sort of an unfortunate part of our bluff definition. It's superfluous. It's not really needed. That's because, a bluff is by definition an area between the toe and the top. And also by, definition, based on an 18% slope measured over a horizontal distance of 25 feet. So you've got a bluff that starts at the toe and ends at the top, and both the toe and the top are defined by an 18% slope measured over a horizontal distance of 25 feet. So every bluff is going to have at least two 25-foot segments of 18%. So I'm pointing this out because I don't want you to be confused by how to treat the phrase measured over any distance, horizontal distance of 25 feet in the bluff definition. So anyways, I'm hoping this makes a little sense to you. Before we move on, if there's any questions about what I just said, I'd like to cover them now. Where the point of this is to make so that you understand what these words mean and how to apply them, and how to answer questions or clear up confusion that a surveyor or a property owner might have.
Dan, you do have a question in the chat, and I apologize, I might have missed it earlier, so maybe you've already addressed it, but they're asking if this information will be available in a PDF.
Yes, we will send this out to you as a PDF. Our goal ultimately is to, once this is finished and recording, transcribe it so that it's accessible, and we'll put the video of this on our training webpage. But yes, we will send you a PDF of this out to all attendees of this training. Thank you. That's a good question, and we did intend to do that. So thanks for asking. All right, so let's apply these written definitions using an actual example. So this example uses data I downloaded from MinTopo, and we have a link to MinTopo in the chat box. If you've never used MinTopo before, I highly recommend using it. It's a great tool for downloading elevation data, And if you have a spreadsheet or other means to manipulate it, that would be great. We have a tool for that I'm working on for specifically for the critical area. But within MinTopo itself, there are some nice tools that you can just use there for looking at slope elevations. So this slope profile actually comes from Dayton. And we have the Mississippi River at the very bottom of this slope here. And I want to point out in this graphic, the elevation is on the vertical or y-axis on the left, and the distance is shown along the bottom horizontal or x-axis. For purposes of simplicity, I chose this example because the toe and the ordinary high are the same. I also want to point out that the scales are different for the two axes, so the graphic can be easily viewed in one image. However, I want to point out that it makes the scaling makes the slope profile look steeper than it actually is. So with that background, let's walk through the bluff definition. And the first criteria, of course, is that a slope has to rise at least 25 feet. And we can see in this case here that the slope rising from about 836 up to about 885 is more than 25 feet. So check, it meets this criteria. The second criteria is that the grade of the slope must be at least 18% over any horizontal distance of 25 feet from the toe to the top. And we spent some time discussing that in the last slide. And as you can see here, I've already determined the location and labeled the toe of the bluff and the top of the bluff with some graphics. So you can see that there are at least two distances of 25 feet that are at least 18%. I've also included the toe of the bluff definition in case you'd like to read that and compare it to the toe of the bluff graphic. As you recall, the toe and the top are really very similar definitions with just some of the words inverted. So in this case here, we can see that the 25-foot horizontal distance in both the toe and the top definitions fulfills the requirement in the bluff definition that the slope averages 18% or greater measured over any horizontal distance of 25 feet. So once again, we kind of say that this particular phrase is really not needed, kind of superfluous. You can keep it in your ordinance, but just be able to explain this and interpret it the way we're talking about today. And I said the reason I'm harping on this a bit is that because there has been some confusion over this already. So the key point we want to make in all this is that the common understanding of measuring slopes is that it's rise over run. So you measure the rise from 2 points, in this case from the toe to the top, over the run, which is the distance along the horizontal axis. And in this case, we actually have a slope that's like 18.4%. So this meets the definition of a MRCCA slope of being a bluff. So keep the big picture in mind. We're really looking for a slope percentage of over 18% from the toe to the top. And then the very last part of our definition talks about where the slope begins below the ordinary high. The ordinary high water level is the toe. This phrase generally works, but it lacks clarity with potential for the idea that there actually could be two bottoms of a bluff. So you certainly could have a bluff where you have one bottom at the ordinary high, and then, for example, you could have another toe that starts sort of partially up the bluff. And so we want you to keep in mind that this is an option and to not read that third bullet point part of the definition too constrictively, because there might be situations where, you could have two bluffs, each with a separate bottom or toe, presumably, maybe with multiple tops as well. So just keep that in mind. It's not going to be very common, but to know that there could be some other toes other than the ordinary high, or you could have both. So, okay, well, let's move on to something less complex, administering variances and conditional use permits. The requirements in your MRCCA ordinance for processing variances to MRCCA standards and for CUPs identified in the MRCA ordinance are nearly the same. You need to evaluate impacts to primary conservation areas, public river corridor views, and other resources identified in your MRCA plan. If impacts are found, then conditions are needed to mitigate the impacts. So these requirements are in addition to other requirements you all likely have for processing variances and CUPs. On the screen is an example of a variance to the bluff setback requirement. In this case, the proposed house doesn't meet the bluff setback, and in fact is proposed to be built in the bluff. So if your planning commission is looking at a variance in this situation, your planning report should outline, what the impacts are, and how they would be, visualized, or how you might see those on the site. So in this case here, we have a structure that's clearly in the bluff, and it doesn't meet the bluff setback. The impacts would be probably removing a lot of vegetation, potential erosion, potential bluff failure. What would be the conditions of approval if this were to be approved? If vegetation is being removed to build this house, does it affect views? Can people across the river see this? Can people, in other parts of the community see it? How does it affect them? You'd want to sort of lay out some of these things. You may want to even look at some sort of visual analysis. If a lot of vegetation is removed in order to site this house, are there other ways to place the house on the site to minimize impacts? Should the house be smaller? Is there different places for access? These are just a variety of things that you would want to look at if you find impacts. And frankly, it would be hard not to find impacts, in an example like this. Also, just one last thing, for variances specifically, your ordinance does require that you make findings that the variance is consistent with the purpose of the MRCA. This does not exist for conditional use permits, but in any case, that's sort of the bottom line for processing variances and CUPs, sort of in a generic sense. If you're dealing with a specific conditional use permit for building height, which is an important part of your ordinance, let's go through that. Earlier, I mentioned that the ordinance allows buildings in the River Townsend Crossings, RTC, and the Urban Mixed Districts, UM, to exceed the height of 48 feet and 65 feet respectively. And so these are important considerations here to work through the conditional use permit process, and to approve such a conditional use permit, the ordinance requires an assessment of the visual impact from the additional height. You'd have to look at the impact on public river corridor views in your community's plan, as well as those public river corridor views identified in other communities. This is especially relevant for projects that are close to or visible from the river. So here's an example of a project in Lilydale. This analysis was professionally prepared by the architect. So in this case, they're looking at the line of vision. In this case, they did from the center line of the Mississippi River. It should have actually technically be done, but from the opposite shore. And if St. Paul on the other side of the river had identified this as a public river corridor view, they would need to get input from St. Paul on how this might affect their public river corridor view defined in their comp plan. I don't think in this case this was defined by St. Paul as a public river corridor view, but had it been, then that would have been part of the assessment. And so that's how this ordinance is a little different than maybe you're used to dealing with impacts. When it comes to views, the ordinance definitely requires involving sort of adjacent communities, which also means communities across the river when it comes to view shed impacts. So if there are impacts, and there certainly are, the ordinance also requires a variety of considerations to reduce the perceived bulk of the structure. And, on the right side of the screen, changing the long axis to be perpendicular to the river, or stepping back portions of a facade, so on and so forth, are some ideas for, reducing the perceived bulk of the structure. So it's an important consideration. It's probably something you've never dealt with before, but I really want to highlight that. In cases where you're dealing with small projects, a variance maybe for a residential property, doing some sort of a visual analysis using Google Earth might be a very effective thing. And we have, a link here to Google Earth, which is also a link in the chat box, but this is on our webpage. And, this shows you how to do a visual analysis using Google Earth. But if it's a project that, is a major project, a commercial project, or a multi-story, multi-family project, the expectation would be that the developer provide a professionally done visual analysis similar to what's on the screen.
Dan, if I can interrupt you, there is a question in the chat regarding the DNR review of CUPs, variance, plats, and site plans. And they're asking, are there any other types of plans that cities are required to provide to DNR to comment on? I think they're pretty comprehensive. I think they've got them all, but anything you can think of?
I think those are all of them. One of my very last slides lays all those out. So I'll get to that in just a moment. So, but yeah, I think that list is pretty on. I'd like to walk through how one might conceptually evaluate impacts to PRCVs for a variance to a building height or a CUP to exceed building height in the RTC or UM districts. First, a visual analysis from the PRCs identifying your plan, as well as those in other communities, is required. That's number one. We just talked about that. Second, the ordinance requires that you identify impacts, but this is undoubtedly hard to do unless you have a baseline to measure those impacts against. And in this case, we suggest you assess impacts from the visual analysis that you get from the developer in relationship to why this public river corridor view was identified as valuable in the first place. And for that information, you're going to have to look at your market plan. We'll get to that shortly. But first, sort of the last item that requires you to do is to identify opportunities to mitigate the impact while still retaining the essence or quality of the scenic view. And if you remember in the previous slide, I mentioned a variety of considerations, such as stepping back the top, that you must consider as possible mitigation. So let's look more closely at how you might approach number 2, reviewing impacts in relation to why this was an identified and valuable view. And so for that, let's go to South St. Paul. This image here is one that they've identified as a public river corridor view. You can see this is the view from this red dot here looking north towards downtown St. Paul. In this case here, to evaluate impacts, you're going to want to look at what the MRCCA plan says about why this view was selected. And so just sort of take a moment to read this phrase or this paragraph from their plan as to why this view is valuable. This plan is really good from the standpoint that even went forward and said, what changes would negatively affect this view. And so, one of them is construction of structures over 50 feet in Kaposia Landing Park, large-scale vegetation clearing along the bluffs and on the islands, off here on the right, the islands, and the addition of vertical barriers along the Mississippi River Trail. And so you can kind of see the trail here in the distance. So they've been very careful about identifying, why this is important to them and what would affect that view. And so, here's a proposal flashing on the screen. Somebody is proposing to build, a 50-foot building in Kaposia Park, Landing Park. And so, this gives us a lot to work with in terms of how you might assess that impact. And so I don't know if anybody has any thoughts or comments on that. Anyone from South St. Paul want to chime in on how you might think about this? But conceptually, this is we think is an appropriate way to look at impacts, is to go back to your comp plan and see why was it important. So we'll move on to some of the finer details of administration. And this gets to the question we just heard, and we're almost finished. But here's some housekeeping topics. Local governments must provide notices of public hearings and of decisions to the DNR, the National Park Service, and adjoining communities for these types of applications. So CUPs, variances, appeals, rezonings, preliminary and final plats, master plans, and PUDs. So that's just for projects in the critical area, not for projects outside the critical area, but just in the critical area. And I want to point out that you only need to provide notice to adjoining communities or overlapping communities for building heights approved through the variance or CUP. However, I do want to mention that overlapping jurisdictions could include park districts such as the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board or the Three Rivers Park District. So these communities have plans and interests in the critical area, and so it's important to notify them as well. Clark, looks like you have a question.
Yeah, so for variances, would this just apply to variances from standards within the MRCA ordinance, or if there's other zoning ordinance or variances from the zoning that are outside of the MRCA ordinance, would that still require DNR review?
Thank you for asking that. We are only interested in getting notices for variances to MRCA standards. So, if it was a variance for a side yard setback, we frankly don't care. we have enough other notifications to look at and possibly comment on. So, we're really only interested in variances to MRCA standards. Just want to point out, and when we say you send comments to the DNR, we mean your area hydro, and you met all three of them at the beginning of this, and we prefer that you send it to their email address. Not a mailed version through U.S. mail, just an email sent notice of hearing and notice of decision would really help us. So there's that. And then lastly, we have just a summary of the different administrative roles that we play. The DNR is here to review and approve your ordinance or your plan and amendments to either the ordinance or the plan. We're here to provide technical assistance, and your area hydro is always your first stop, but I'm also available to help out too, as the case may be. We do comment on variances, CUPs, plats, and PUDs. We don't comment on everything, but we do look at ones that are probably more significant, and we'll comment on those if we have time. We do training and education, and then just long-term, we do monitor local government decisions for patterns of non-compliance or poor decisions. We know that variances are a normal part of ordinance administration, but if we see a particular pattern, allowing tall buildings to go up, with variances or conditional use permit, that seems to be sort of stretching the boundaries of what the ordinance is trying to accomplish with its considerations and requirements. We would be watching for those sorts of things. And for you, your job is to adopt and amend ordinances as you see fit with DNR review and approval. Of course, you administer, enforce, and make decisions on a variety of decisions, and then you keep us notified when you do those sorts of things. And then lastly, just want to remind you that we have a variety of tools. And these are all links in the chat box. Just want to, if you haven't looked at these two mappers, please do. They're very helpful and easy to use. We also have a series of customizable permitting forms and guidance on this page called Local Government Administration. You'll find all this stuff at the bottom. At the very bottom, we have our GIS data links, but you'll see a lot of things here like, the vegetation permit. Here's a property owner guide. And so These are all Word templates with our logo on them, but the idea is described in the red text at the top is that you should replace our logo with your logo and update this to be consistent with what your ordinance says. And everyone has a slightly different ordinance, but you should make this match what your ordinance says. There are a lot of there's a lot of commentary in here to explain different provisions and to highlight areas where your ordinance might be different than the model. But if you take some time and maybe modify these guidance documents for your community, it might save you some time in answering questions with property owners who have projects in mind that they want to do that require permits. There's guides. We have sample application forms, permit review guides for both vegetation and land alteration permits. And we also have similar application review supplement and guidance forms for variance and conditional use permits to try to highlight all the pieces of the ordinance that should be considered during sort of these particular permits or approvals. So a lot of detail in these items, way more detail than I've covered today, but it's the sort of detail that is needed for the administrative type level of work. So with that, I think we are at the end. We have a little bit of time left, and I'm happy to answer questions or have a discussion with any of you about particular elements or even your ordinance if you have some questions about where you're at in the approval process or maybe even thinking about some amendments.
Dan, this is Michael Healy, South St. Paul. I do have one question just to follow up. So the setback averaging provisions for the top of bluff, I think you had answered a question earlier asking if there's two houses that are too close to the bluff, the house in the middle, obviously, if it's a new house, is allowed to be built with the same setback. But I think you had said that that would not apply to an addition onto an existing house. So I guess I just want to wrap my head around that because it kind of sounds like somebody would be rewarded for tearing down a house and building a new house, they'd get a smaller setback. But if they were trying to adaptively reuse the existing house and just build an addition, they would not. Is that really how we want to administer it?
Yeah, I mean, there is that provision so that if somebody has, say, a non-conforming house now and they want to add on to it, they can add on to it laterally without a variance. So that's one way of trying to make it easier for somebody who has an existing structure to just work with that and just laterally add on to it, even though without that provision, it would require a variance.
But if the two houses on either side have a 30 and they want to do a 30 as well, they can't do it unless they knock their house down and build a new one at 30? That's the right read?
Yeah, if you think that you have some particular risk in that area in your community, I mean, clearly it's not desirable to have a lot of people doing that and building closer to a bluff. That might warrant some changes that are particularly suited to your community. But
we do have a lot of houses on top of the bluff, so
yeah,
that are pretty close.
So this like any rulemaking, it's sort of, I hate to say it, but it's sort of a one size fits all. It's a set of regulations that don't work for every single community, but it's sort of the best possible approach given the constraints of a rulemaking process. But there's certainly options within the rules to modify standards for specific situations and through the flexibility elements as you well know, but for other things too, we could even look at some of these provisions.
I guess we could always steer those people towards a variance rather than knocking down their house and building a new one.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Hey, Dan, for me, everything was pretty clear, except for that bluff stuff you went through. You make it like more clear on when, because I mean the bluffs have been mapped. It's on your mapping application. I would look to see that it's surveyed and such. But it sounds like there's been some confusion with the definitions and how to apply the rule. Like the example you gave, that was one bluff. That's not two bluffs, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Let me just go back to that just to pull it back up on the screen here. Yeah. So
I guess what's the key factor in determining that this is one bluff versus two?
In this case, you meet the definition from the toe or the ordinary high to the top. This is more than 18% here. Now, it's possible in another scenario, if this, this sort of flat area right here, suppose this area were even flatter and longer, okay, this whole stretch right here. In that situation, this is not going to be 18%. It's going to be something less, because you have a greater distance in here and let's say a flatter slope here. So, when you do the calculations, you're going to get something less than 18%. In that case, you'd want this here. This would be your toe of the slope in this case. So you would have a slope starting here at the toe, rising up and going to here. This stretch from here to here is definitely a bluff. It is definitely exceeds 18%. In fact, I think this is probably close to around 26 or 28% when I calculated it. So this is a situation where you could have something that overall looks like this, but this lower part would not be part of the bluff. And this definition up here still works in that situation, where the slope begins below the ordinary high. Well, that's the confusing part here, why I tried to clarify this. So you could say that there's a slope down here because it's 18% right here. And you could say, well, the ordinary high is the toe, but then you would say from the toe to the top in the scenario I painted for you, it was less than 18%. So what I was trying to say is to not eliminate the possibility that this is the toe. Do you get what I'm saying? I'm glad you brought this question up because this is sort of at the heart of what I was trying to get at when I was talking about this last phrase here. And I granted, this is complex and it's hard to talk about sometimes. So I may be confusing you more right now, but if I am, I want to be clear.
I get the last part where the toe of the bluff is the OHWL. But I mean, what defines it as a slope over a horizontal distance? It's just the greater than 18%.
Right. What you're ultimately looking for is an 18% slope from a toe to the top. And the toe could be the ordinary high. The toe could be somewhere else, like here. And I just don't want people to think that, the slope begins below the ordinary high, which is kind of crazy language, but that's what we have. It says the ordinary high is this toe. Okay, so presumably, this is just LiDAR data, and so right here we're measuring the surface of the river, but we know the slope, goes down. Okay, so under the strict reading of this last bullet point, you would say where the slope begins below the ordinary high is the toe. Okay, and since you have this 18% slope over 25 feet, you could say, well, that is legitimately the toe. But when you measure from the toe to the top in a scenario that I painted where, this area is flatter or much longer, you're not going to get a bluff. But if you count this as the toe here and this is the top, you still meet all the other criteria and this would be a bluff.
Got it.
We've had some issues like this that need some explanation in the shoreland program, and we did a guidance document for understanding bluffs in shoreland, and I also intend to do a guidance document for bluffs in the critical area to help explain this in a written format too. When that's available, I'll let all of you know, hopefully soon.
One other question about that. So if you, in the hypothetical scenario you were doing for where the toe of the bluff is the middle point on the graphic you're showing, and the top of bluff, say the slope ends before it rises 25 feet, does that negate it from being a bluff? So say it still rises, 30%, but it never climbs to rise in elevation 25 feet. So your toe on this example is somewhere in like the 852, 853 elevation. Say your top ended before it actually rose 25 feet. Does that mean it's not a bluff then in consideration? Because that's part of the definition.
That's right. That would not be a bluff. The bluff, to be a bluff, it has to rise at least 25 feet from the toe to the top. Okay. But just to point out, in this particular situation, from this point, this toe here to this point, it is 25 feet still. So
yeah, I just wanted to confirm that because sometimes you have great slopes, but they're not considered bluffs. So they might rise, it might be a 30% grade, but it doesn't rise 25 feet. So it's not considered a bluff. And that, just clarifying that, because that's a discussion that comes up a lot of times when you're working with a homeowner.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And you're right. It does have to rise 25 feet from the toe to the top. And if it doesn't, it's not a bluff. Well, I appreciate everybody coming today and hanging out for a couple hours. If you have any further questions about what we talked today, send me an email or call me. Some of these things are just easier to talk about in person. And, check out our website if you haven't done that yet either. So appreciate everybody's attention. We're glad you're out there administering the MRCCA ordinance. Take care, everyone. And
thanks, everybody.
Talk later. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.